Good evening, Bernice. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Well, I'm glad you've joined us. At least we've gotten that far.
Yes.
That's always
Yes.
reassuring. You never know with Zoom. So,
Whoops. Yes.
so
I'm
people,
going to try now to share my screen and see if I can get the slides up.
okay.
Okay.
Hi, Diane. This is Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Let's see.
We're early. We have about 10 minutes, so.
Good.
Better this way.
Absolutely.
Yes. So if by any chance my internet goes down or I will call Cynthia, I'll try to continue. I wonder if I should almost send you the PowerPoint.
Send it to Cynthia.
Should I send it
Yeah,
to her?
better
Okay.
that I have the screen for the participants and everybody else, and she can work on getting it mounted from her computer.
Just in case. Okay,
Okay.
let's see.
And that's boazc@sonoma.edu.
Okay. Okay. So you would like me to speak for about an hour and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers?
That's typically our format, and it seems to work well. We've gotten many more questions since we've been on Zoom. I think the
Oh,
students
great.
feel much more confident.
Can you tell me a little bit about the audience?
Well, 99 of them are students in our Holocaust and Genocide lecture series course. And a couple of, about 2/3 of them have already had a discussion section that is at least in part devoted to your topic. So I hope that they're well prepared. They're certainly very interested in what you have to say. And then the rest of our community are people who belong to the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. And Barbara will be introducing this segment because tonight is our Sylvia Sucher Memorial Lecture. And then we'll ask you to follow her. And other members of the community that have an interest, and Barbara has already screened them, so they're carefully chosen.
Okay.
And
Okay.
you'd be thrilled to know that I just got an urgent email from somebody who said, can I please get the link? I was actually born in Bergen-Belsen.
Oh, my.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
Okay.
my.
So
Oh.
I think Diane, you might have a heads up if she adds a comment in. Her name is Zipporah Glass,
Okay.
and she's fairly new to us.
Oh, all right.
But we've been thrilled at the response from the members of the community who are interested in this series, and a lot of people who are new to this series this time.
Good.
Great. That's great.
So Bernice, do you need Cynthia's help in putting your slides up, or do you think you're
Well,
ready
if
to go with that?
no, I think I could put my slides up. I just share the screen, put them up. The only time I would need Cynthia's help is if for some reason my internet goes down.
Oh,
In
okay.
which case I have her phone
Okay.
number and I will call you right away and you can, please God, that won't happen.
Yes.
But if it does happen, we
Okay.
can continue it that way because, yeah.
So you don't need me then I'm not I'm not necessarily playing the videos then for you.
Yeah,
You're,
so
oh,
the
you're playing the
videos, the videos I need you for, because I have
oh, okay.
an antiquated computer. I couldn't embed them into my PowerPoint.
You
Oh, I
have-
see. Okay.
So
No problem.
when I cue you up, I guess I'll just say, okay, now I'll stop sharing the screen, and Cynthia will play this video.
Okay.
And
Gotcha.
we'll
That
do
should
it
work.
like that. So there's
All right,
three
I-
very short ones.
So
Yeah, I
Bernice,
have
do
them
you
all
have a
lined
lot
up
of
here.
snow back there?
We didn't get so much snow here. In New
Okay.
York, south of us, we did. They
All
got
right.
17 inches where my mom is. We only got like a few inches and that turned to slush.
Otherwise, I would be worried about an internet disconnection.
Yeah, last night I was worried. I was on and I was a little concerned. It was a storm, but I mean, 95% of the time it works fine.
Great.
There's another like 5% of the time. So you must be Diane.
I'm Diane.
Diane. So thank you so much for communicating with me.
Oh
So-
yeah, because it says Holocaust and Genocide lecture series
Yeah,
for
well,
you
no,
instead of
yeah.
your name. Yeah.
That's my alias.
Also, Barbara, all we can see is the top half of your head. Is there a way to like tilt your computer? There you go.
There you
Now we
go.
can see you.
All right. Yeah, but
We
look at
couldn't
the
see.
charming.
Hey, Mac.
Yeah, there he is. All right. Well, we only have
All right.
32
These
people
people
on at
on the
this
Alliance
point.
Board, they're an odd bunch.
Yes. Okay, we still have 5 minutes. We give people-
So is this a
Right.
class that meets regularly?
Yes, we have 3 discussion sections associated with the lecture series, and they meet every week for 2 hours. So that gives us a chance to prepare them and provide some background on the subjects of the week. It works well.
Okay, great.
And every semester, we teach it once every year. And because it's a little bit of a task to get 16 people here for the lectures, but we always have 100 students enrolled in the course.
Is it easier now with doing it virtually to
Oh,
get
yeah.
this?
As soon as I figure out Zoom, it'll be much easier because we don't have to worry about logistics. We just have to worry about the computer.
Yeah. Yeah. It's strange how this sort of silver lining to the pandemic,
Exactly.
which is so devastating.
That's
It's
right.
opened up the world. Yeah.
I would rather have things back to normal, but there are advantages. So,
So the $1 million question will be when it does go back to
I
normal.
know.
Will you have speakers come fly in live, or local people come in, or
Well,
will you continue the?
We'll see what kind of funding we have, because the school budget is apparently not too good, but I imagine we'll have kind of a hybrid. We'll have both,
Yeah, that's good.
and
That
then we
makes
can
sense.
afford more distinguished speakers like yourself.
That's very kind. That's very kind.
58. Do you give this presentation often, Bernice?
Yeah, I've given several. I've honed it depending on the audience, but
Mhm.
I really tried to really focus on the theme overcoming adversity.
Yes.
So this is the first time I'm giving this one for just,
Oh.
especially for Sonoma State.
Thank you. Well, that keeps it alive for you too.
Oh, it's my
Always
pleasure.
tweaking.
It's my pleasure. Yeah. Yeah.
Diane, I have a couple of slides that I will do as a screen share, if that will work for you.
I think so.
I have a picture of Sylvia that I'll show
Okay.
when we get to that point. And then I have done the briefest of descriptions of members of our survivor community who recently died.
Uh-huh.
But
All the-
I've cut it way back because we have both the intro to the Alliance and the Suker lecture this year. So I've tried
Right.
to
Right.
slim it down. I'm sorry we couldn't do it, part of it last week.
Well.
We
Zoom
do what we
being
can.
what it is.
Hey, I'm on screen this
That's
time,
right.
which is
exactly.
great. Thank
And you're
you.
talking. So you have, as a panelist, you can share. So,
Great.
yeah.
I noticed that Todd has already put a comment in.
Oh,
It's Todd.
okay.
So I will speak for 1 hour straight. Is that it? I'll tell Cynthia when to put up the videos. And then after that, Q&A for about how long?
As long as it goes, we typically, we don't go over time. So, but
Okay.
if we don't have too many questions, then we can leave a little early.
Okay.
Boy, they all come in right on time. You know,
Oh, wow.
that jumped in a hurry.
I'm used to doing regular Zoom classes rather than webinars.
Yes, this is different. This
Yeah.
is a little different. All right, so I guess we're up to 98. I guess we can begin if everybody's ready. All right. Good evening, everyone. We're very pleased to be here this week with Dr. Bernice Lerner, who will be speaking on the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. But before she does, we remind you that this week is our Sylvia Suture Memorial Lecture. And to tell you a bit about Sylvia Suture and the purpose of the lecture, we bring you Dr. Barbara McCaffrey, the president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, and Professor Emerita from the Hutchins School of Liberal Studies at Sonoma State. Barbara.
Good afternoon. As the president of the board of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, it's an honor to participate in the lecture series and introduce you to the community group that supports this unique course and this year's Sylvia G. Sucher Memorial Lecture. For many years, a group in Petaluma coordinated an annual Warsaw Ghetto Uprising remembrance, and that became an annual Holocaust commemoration, Yom HaShoah, that continues to this day. The university president, Peter Diamandopoulos, was the keynote speaker in 1983. After the event, he challenged Robert L. Harris, that year's coordinator, to do more than just memorialize the Holocaust in an annual event. Harris asked a number of people to assist him in responding to the president's challenge, including Sylvia Sucher. You'll hear more about Mr. Harris later in the semester, as there's also a lecture in his honor that'll happen in, I think, next month. The Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust was formed in 1983 on behalf of victims and survivors and the desire to tell their stories and learn from their experiences. Those who began this collaborative effort between the community and members of the Sonoma State University faculty promised to let the world know of the atrocities that had occurred. The initial intention was primarily to learn the facts, act on them, and never forget. As a result of this effort, this highly successful lecture series on the Holocaust and Genocide, now in its 38th year, was created at Sonoma State University. It initially included 5 to 6 lectures a year and grew into this upper division general education course that currently enrolls 100 students annually. Almost from its inception, the series included lectures on other genocides as well as the Holocaust. As a university community partnership, the university covers the salary of the faculty and the academic coordinator for the series, and the Alliance engages in outreach to the community, fundraising, and grant writing to cover a significant percent of the cost of bringing our guest speakers. The Alliance board includes members of the community, university faculty and administrators, and students who participated in the lecture series. Its current mission is to co-sponsor the series, support Sonoma State's Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide in providing programming to the larger community, including secondary school teachers, and collaborate with other community groups working on issues related to the Holocaust and Genocide. In 2010, the name was changed to the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide to reflect its continuing educational commitment to include all those affected by genocide. And 4 years ago, the Alliance Education Committee expanded to include outreach to local middle and high school principals and teachers, coordinating lectures by Holocaust and genocide survivors and their descendants, and recruiting and training survivors and descendants who'd not previously spoken to student groups. Looks like I'm not able to share my screen, but that's okay. If that happens, I'll switch. Today's lecture is in memory of Sylvia G. Suker, who was born in 1912, the child of immigrants from Berlin and Russia. At the age of 4, she contracted polio, which affected the left side of her body, and many years later led to post-polio syndrome. But that experience seemed to strengthen rather than diminish her throughout her life. In college, she studied speech therapy and later pursued a career in teaching. And after her husband's death, she moved to Santa Rosa and became one of the founding members of the Alliance. She was also involved in the planning committee for the annual Yom HaShoah commemoration and encouraged local Holocaust survivors to tell their stories to students in local middle and high schools, a tradition which is now part of the mission of the Alliance Education Committee. Members of that committee, I think I've already covered that, were also indebted to Sylvia for her amazing skills in creating an endowment named for a former Sonoma State faculty member and Alliance board member and Holocaust survivor, Paul V. Benko. After Paul's death in 1999, Sylvia almost single-handedly contacted members of the community to create a fund in his memory, the proceeds of which are one of the major sources of the annual funding for the series. In an interview in 2003, she said, "You know, life is full of little quirks and twists. You may get thrown for a while, but then you've got to straighten up and brush yourself off and go on." Sylvia died on June 26, 2017, just short of her 104th birthday. She continues to inspire us. We are so pleased that her daughter, Saib Amar, is able to be with us this afternoon, as is Arlene Thomas, an Alliance board member who has underwritten this lecture. It's our tradition to remember any Holocaust survivors in our community who've died in the past year. This year, we'll be remembering both Lucille Eichengreen and Claude Gans. Lucille was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1925 and was a survivor of the Lodz ghetto, Auschwitz, and Neuengamme, and was liberated after a forced march to Bergen-Belsen in the early winter of 1945. While in the camps, in an act of quiet resistance, she memorized the names of 42 Germans who operated several of those death camps. Her remarkable memory made her one of the most effective post-war trial witnesses and led to the arrest of 41 former SS officers. She wrote 3 books about her experience and also spoke a number of times in this series. She said that she survived with the friendship of other women and men, lived only on food rations, and hungered most of the time, and reiterated that only friendship sustained me, not hope. She implored others to act, not to be quiet, even in the face of grave personal danger. She died on February 7th of last year. Claude Gans and his family fled Germany. Is my screen showing,
No,
Diane?
No.
Sorry about that. Claude Gans and his family fled Germany during the occupation. His family went to France, where they were arrested in 1941 by the French collaborators. Placed in deportation camp, Claude and his family escaped on foot over the mountains to Switzerland during the winter of 1943. And after 4 years of internment as a refugee there, he and his family were able to come to the United States.
Barbara,
He'll be remembered.
try sharing again.
Okay.
No. There we go. Now we see
All
it.
right. All right. This is a photo of Sylvia, Lucille, and Claude. Claude will be remembered for his expertise with startup businesses, as well as his humanitarian and philanthropic efforts. He was a tireless advocate for Jewish education as a way to promote interfaith harmony. Recognized as the driving force in the formation of the Jewish Studies program, Claude was awarded an honorary doctorate at Sonoma State University. When asked what sustained him during his darkest times and the lessons which he learned from those experiences, he replied that his family's commitment to remaining Jewish held them together when the entire world seemed to abandon them. He died very recently on January 24th. We also remember Louis Kenneth Hopfer, a Holocaust descendant who had been working with the Alliance Education Committee to share his mother's story of survival with local middle and high school students. He died this past October. May their memories be a blessing for all those whose lives their stories touched. A quick word that the Alliance also sponsors an annual Sonoma County commemoration of the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah, with other local organizations. This year's program will be held on Sunday, April 11th at 2 p.m. We hope you'll be able to join us, and we'll be providing more information as we get closer to the date. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Barbara. If you could stop your screen sharing now so we can, thank you. Okay. It's our pleasure again to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Bernice Lerner, a senior scholar at Boston University's Center for Character and Social Responsibility and former Dean of Adult Learning at Hebrew College. She's the author of All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen. In this book, she tells the story of her mother, Rachel Ganuth, who was 15 when the British Second Army liberated Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945. She also tells the story of H.L. Glynn Hughes, the high-ranking officer who found himself responsible for relief efforts at the notorious concentration camp. In efforts to learn how her mother, one of thousands of war-ravaged inmates, was saved, Bernice traced the journeys of Hughes and Rachel as they navigated their respective forms of hell during the final brutal year of World War II. Their narratives tell a larger story about the suffering of the victims, the struggles of liberators who strove to save lives, and about the human capacity for fortitude and redemption. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Bernice Lerner.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much to Diane for helping to organize this, to Cynthia for her tech help, and for Barbara for your wonderful introduction to the series. And to the students, I really am grateful to be speaking to Sonoma State University students. So the topic is for this series is overcoming adversity. So I've been thinking a lot about adversity and this sort of state or instance of serious or continued difficulty or misfortune. And I'm going to be talking to you about an extreme situation, but I just want to put some questions out there to you. What does adversity do to a person? And we just had this example from Sylvia, who was stricken with polio at a young age and had lasting effects from it. How did it affect her and her decisions and her choices? And we were given the accounts of Lucille and Claude, 2 Holocaust survivors, and how did adversity affect them? Does adversity sensitize a person? Does it embitter them? Does it depress them? And then there are all these variables. What type of adversity? What is the duration of that adversity? And what are sort of the biological endowments that people bring to a certain situation that helps them to overcome adversity? And I also want you to think about what does it take really to overcome adversity? Does it take time? Does it take positive interactions or experiences to counteract the really terrible negative things that happened? And does it give a person a sense of, I have coped with this terrible thing. The next bad thing that comes along, I've learned about myself that I can cope. So I just want to bring to your attention one thing before I show you slides and get into my talk. And that is this last week, this Boston Globe article of an obituary. I have this habit of reading obituaries. And this is of Christina Crosby, who died at a young age. But it tells the story of how when she had just turned 50 years old, she was just 3 miles from her home riding her bike when a branch got stuck in the wheel. She fell over, she smashed her face, and she snapped her neck. And in an instant, her life changed. She was paralyzed for the rest of her life. So she wrote several, she was a dynamic person and she was a professor. She wrote a book about it. And in one of her writings, she said, "The typical disability narrative carries the troubled subject through painful trials to livable accommodations and lessons learned, and all too often sounds the note triumphant." She wrote, "Don't believe it." So so that is one sort of perspective on it. And it's not that she didn't go on to do remarkable things with her life, but there are certain things that stay with you. So I'm going to share my screen now. And
There you go.
and can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is overcoming adversity, and I put in there overcoming extreme adversity because Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war in the winter and spring of 1945 was the outermost limit of the human experience, and I will explain what happened. Now, I did, as Diane mentioned in her very kind introduction, I wrote a book. It was recently published called All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And I'm just putting up this image now so you can see that that I had a publisher in the UK at the same time as I had the US publisher, Johns Hopkins, and what they did with the images that I gave them, they had the same images, but they came up with completely different book titles and covers. So here, this is a picture of my mom, and this is one of the first pictures we have of her. It's about 6 or 7 months after the war. She's just had turned 16 in this picture, and she is not like some of the cheerful pictures you might see of some survivors after the liberation, particularly those in their 20s and 30s who are mourning their losses, but building new lives. Here, my mom has this like hollow look in her expression, and she is depressed. I mean, she lost her entire family. Only she and her older sister survived out of a family of about 30 people, including 4 younger siblings, her parents and her grandmother. And she is very sick in this picture. She is very sick with tuberculosis, and she is at a sanatorium in northwest Sweden. So that's where this picture was taken. She's already nourished, she's had food, but her lungs are in very bad shape. And this is a picture of my other protagonist, Glyn Hughes, who was the Deputy Director of Medical Services of the entire British Second Army at the time they walked into this hell, this concentration camp called Bergen-Belsen. And here he is in his caravan. He might be writing up the diets for the starved people. He came upon 60,000 war-ravaged souls, and my mom was one of them. So the protagonists came to this situation with their own experiences of adversity, and I'm just going to mention them really quickly. Glyn Hughes was, at the time he entered Bergen-Belsen, he was a 52-year-old seasoned military medical officer. He had won numerous medals and honors, and he was very brave, very courageous in combat. But his history, his background may have had something to do with his character. As a child, he lost his father at the age of 2, and he was diagnosed at the age of 5 or 6 as being very sickly and had to be wheeled around in a spinal carriage. There was something wrong with his spine, and you can just imagine a 6 or 7-year-old kid having to be wheeled around in a carriage for a long period of time. This is what it looked like at that time. This was in the late 1800s, it was around 1895, 1896. And then he had this sort of miraculous liberation when he was sent away to a boarding school for the sons of military men, and he became a star athlete. So he had his own sort of meteoric rise and his own overcoming adversity at a young age. And here he is right after World War I on a rugby team. He became one of the father figures of rugby football in England. So anyway, I'm just sharing a little bit about his background. And a little bit about my mom's background. She came from this beautiful town of Siget. These are some pictures of before she was even born, but you can see that it's surrounded by mountains. Siget means island, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful town. It is up here in the north in this map of Romania. Hungary came in with the time that she was deported and took over this entire region. And I explain why in the book. And just to say, it was very close. Siget here's Auschwitz, and here's Siget, and it was about a 3-4 day train ride there. So my mom had an experience of adversity, even though as you study the Holocaust, you'll learn that there were 6 death camps set up in Poland, and by 1943, 75% of Jewish European Jewry had been killed, had been massacred. And the Germans did not come into, Hungary had come into where she lived in 1940, but the Germans didn't actually enter that part where she lived in Romania, changed borders to Hungary. The area region was called Transylvania. Didn't come in until March of 1944. So that is when the Holocaust in a major way happened to Hungarian Jewry. They were rapid fire deported to Auschwitz. They were rounded up very quickly. It was not like the Polish Jews who had stayed for extended periods of time, perhaps in ghettos, depending where they were. But my mom, when she was 10 years old and 11 years old, she had suffered great adversity because of the terrible thing that happened to her family. And this was, so I think of my mom as being in the Holocaust from the very beginning to the very end, because the very first mass killing by guns, by bullets, took place in Kamenets-Podilsk in the Ukraine in August 1941. And among the people rounded up and deported to this place in the Ukraine, where 23,000 people were shot into these mass graves, was her aunt and uncle and their families, including their spouses and her 5 little cousins. And her family was never the same since these people were taken away from their lives. And if any of you are familiar with Elie Wiesel and you've read his book, Night, he talks about this man, Moshe the Beadle, who had also been taken away from Siget, from their town during this transport, who several months later came back and told what happened. And he had been shot in the leg, laid there all night until the Nazis disappeared, crawled out, eventually made his way back to Siget, told about what happened, and everybody thought he was a madman. But I think that my grandmother, Rachel's mother, did believe him, and this is what happened. So from the very beginning, my mother suffered this adversity. The way I decided to tell the story and write the book was to tell it over 1 year's time. So, because that is where the most eventful year of the war was for my 2 protagonists, starting with Rachel from Siget being taken away very quickly with her family to Auschwitz. This was the actual train route, which doesn't exist anymore. And then from Auschwitz being deported to Christianstadt, which is a labor camp. And then being forced on a death march because the Nazis were really hell bent on getting the inmates away from would-be liberators, right? The Russians were approaching from over here and they wanted to get whoever survived, whatever inmates were remaining, these were the ones that were strong and young, away from the Allied forces. They could not fall alive into Allied hands. And my mother was part of a death march of about 1,000 women until they put them, they couldn't decide what to do with them. It was very chaotic and disorganized. We're talking February of 1945. The Germans had lost the war already. They were just concentrating on killing as many Jews as possible. And she was taken on another cattle wagon to Bergen-Belsen. Glyn Hughes, so the rescuer. So this becomes, in a way, a very personal story because it was a race against time. And of course, this race was lost for too many thousands of people, and it cost too many thousands of lives to rescue them. But on a very micro level, on the story of my mom, who is in Bergen-Belsen, had the British Second Army come in even like 4 days later, she wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be here, none of us would, none of the family, my children, my grandchildren, nobody would be here. It was very in the nick of time that the British came in. So this was the year, at the time the Jews were being deported from Siget, this was very close, they were very close to planning for the D-Day invasion. Glyn Hughes was among the higher ups who was planning, and he had very detailed records of how many casualties there would be on during the Normandy landing and how were they going to evacuate the wounded. But so this tells, so I tell the story over 1 year's time by seasons. What is taking place in the spring of 1944, then the summer after the D-Day landing, and my mom's in Auschwitz, and then as the British fight their way up through Normandy, up through France, into Belgium, into the Netherlands, and finally breach the fortress of Germany, the Rhine crossing, and then unbelievable a thing occurs where Bergen-Belsen, 3 weeks before the end of World War II, is handed over to the British Second Army by the German army. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. It's sort of a truth is stranger than fiction story involving Heinrich Himmler's masseuse. Don't ask, it was a very dramatic event. But here's Glyn Hughes, who's consumed with all kinds of other things. He's giving directions to his assistant directors of medical services. They're engaged in all kinds of battles. They have the surprise of the Battle of the Bulge and what is their role in that and helping the Americans. So many things are going on, and he did not anticipate being a liberator. He was a very planful person. He had everything mapped out, constantly improvising on the fly, but a lot of details went into the planning and practice, and he had no practice for what they came upon. So this is just a couple of images of the kinds of, this is Glyn Hughes's notes, and I was very, very immersed in the archive, his archives and his pages of billions of pages of notes. But this just shows you that he writes D+1, D+2, D+3, after the D-Day landing, what is happening on the Neptune beach, casualties, and how many casualties they're anticipating and what's taking place. And just other of his notes, how he's organizing the neurosurgical units, maxillofacial units, surgical teams, and everything is planned down to the minute. General hospitals, how many beds are available, how does he commandeer hospitals, until, of course, April 15th, 1945, 3 days after the Germans hand the camp, sign a treaty with the British Second Army saying that there's a camp in the path of the battles and they're going to turn it over to the British. And it's for its international concerns about health. That's why, because there is an epidemic of typhus in the camp. And if any of the fighting takes place in the area and the inmates break out, they could spread it to the soldiers and to the civilian population. So April 15th, 1945, my mom is already at Bergen-Belsen. She's been there for a month. And in fact, in March of 1945, she probably arrived there just a couple of weeks or 10 days after Anne Frank died there. And Anne Frank was a little bit older than her. And the norm was to die there. That was the norm. There, 17 to 18,000 people died in the month of March alone. And this is an image of the camp where in the last desperate efforts, the SS tried to clean up the camp. There were corpses, piles of corpses everywhere, and they forced the inmates to drag the corpses themselves. Whoever was able to still walk, who was ever still ambulatory, had to drag the skeletons to a mass grave at the end of a long road bisecting the camp with 3 compounds on one side and 2 on the other. And I remember very vividly the night that I was downstairs at home in the laundry room where my mom would often iron, and I would talk to her. And I remembered when she put down the iron and bent over, stretched her arms behind her, and demonstrated for me how she, who was maybe 50% dead, she was half dead. They hadn't had no food or water for many days, and it was, everyone was sick. There was epidemics. 3 epidemics were raging: typhus, tuberculosis, and gastroenteritis. Everybody was so sick. And she was 90% dead and 50% dead. And she said, and I had to drag bodies who were 90% dead. Some were still breathing to the end of the road here. And that's how they pressed them into service until that had to stop, because they were people who were in that bad shape and that extreme were dying on the road. And I'm telling you all this because before I'm telling you about overcoming adversity, I'm telling you about this extreme adversity. So I tremble a little bit showing you these images because I don't have permission from these people to show their images. And it was, I know that I could show pictures also, and that anyone who was there, including any of the liberators or survivors, would say that no picture could show how really terrible it was. And here you see on the left, after the liberation, the SS are pressed into service to whoever's remaining. There was about 80 SS who were there during the handover of the camp. Hundreds had escaped, they just walked away. But those who remained were forced by the British Army soldiers to help to bury the corpses that were all over the camp and in mass graves. And if you go to Bergen-Belsen today, you will see signs like 5,000 buried in this grave or 1,000 buried in this grave. And honestly, it was all guesswork. It was just, there were 55 to 60,000 people who were still alive, breathing, very, very sick when the British got there. And there were corpses, there was at least 10,000 unburied corpses, and people were dying 500 a day after the liberation. And this is Rabbi Leslie Hardman, who was the chaplain for the British Second Army, who was totally, he was just bereft at how people were being thrown helter-skelter into these graves. And there was nothing they could do. This was Glyn Hughes's decision. And because of the risk of cholera and the spread of disease, it was an impossible situation. And here on the upper right, you see, here's a girl with a square cut out of the back of her coat. And I included this because it says something. The prisoners, when my mom came from a labor camp, all the prisoners on the death march, they all had square, even while working in the labor camp, they had squares cut out of the back of their coat. Lest they try to escape, they should be easily identifiable as halfling, as prisoners. And here, the British, 3 days after the liberation, the British 11th Light Field Ambulance came and pitched tents everywhere because the huts were just very overcrowded. The dead were lying together with the living, and they had a hard time getting even a sip of water to people who couldn't make it out to the food stations they set up. So whoever could still walk had to get out of the huts and stay in tents. And there's a big story about my mom, how she first went out and then had to go back into a hut. And this story is also an image that would have been very familiar to my mother, because they were trying to bake a couple of potatoes that they ran at great risk to get, because even after the liberation, there was the British didn't have enough manpower. They put Hungarians in charge and they were shooting at the inmates. So if you could grab a few potatoes and manage to cook them or heat them up, the background was always dead people, and they were inured to it because there were dead people lying everywhere who couldn't make it. And here's another image from the camp. So the distance from the huts to the tents is significant in my mom's story, because she was crawling on all fours back and forth between them. And in the book, I describe what happened, how she then returned to the hut and got severely beaten up by her fellow prisoners. So then the rescue. So this is the kind of thing that Glenn Hughes and his men masterminded. And we know from what's happening now with COVID, we know from what happened with Hurricane Katrina, we know what happens in all places around the world when you need a rescue effort, is that it takes time to organize, and they had to do it very quickly. So they did this sort of triage, and you know how today and people in the hospitals or who are treating COVID patients have to wear personal protective equipment. So these are the British soldiers who are evacuating, who are going hut by hut. A medic went in and marked people who were still breathing, who had a chance of survival, with an X on their forehead, and they were evacuating them in contaminated ambulances to a human laundry, what they called the human laundry, a cavalry stable that they set up with about 60 tables. And they were really short on help. So they pressed German nurses into service, with the British overseers, soldiers, washing them as they washed and sprayed these skeletal inmates with DDT. After they were decontaminated, they were put in a clean ambulance and taken to a makeshift hospital. So here are just some numbers that are of interest, because that's how we make sense of tragedies, right? We're constantly in the newspaper, on the news, we're reading about numbers, like numbers of COVID patients, numbers of people coming down with it, numbers who've died in this country, around the world, other places. So this is a way of getting a handle on things. So just, there were 2 million British and other Allied soldiers concentrated in southern England in May of 1944, getting ready for the D-Day landing, for breaking through the German fortress. 14,000 Jews were deported in 7 or 8 trains daily from Hungary to Auschwitz from May 15th to July 9th, 1944. So this was the quickest mass killing probably in the history of the world. 440,000 Jews were taken from Hungary to Auschwitz. 90% were murdered right away. The gas chambers were equipped with what was needed. There was a lot of preparations the SS took to make this happen. 145 trains used to deport the Jews from Hungary could have transported at least 7 divisions of German infantry and panzer units to the west to help repulse the Allied invasion, but no, this was a priority. The time my mother was in Auschwitz, it was the size of a small city. There were 31,000 female prisoners and close to 20,000 male prisoners. Fast forward, in the spring of 1945, there were 55 to 60,000 sick and dying prisoners found in Bergen-Belsen. 2/3 were women, 1/3 men, 400 to 500 were children. The children were there under special circumstances. It was kind of unusual for a child to have made it. But these were, by and large, these 55 to 60,000 were the survivors. Remember, they had evaded the gas chambers, and they had survived the death marches, and they had on poor nutrition or nothing to eat, barely water. These were the strongest, the remnant of the Jewish people, mostly Jewish people. And there were some also Polish and other people who were political prisoners. And of this number, 25,000 were considered fit. They were able to walk. Like if you could walk up one step, you were considered fit, and you were transferred to a formerly Wehrmacht transition and rehabilitation barracks. And it was back and forth. Like you could have been considered fit and then wound up in the hospital area. So it was, people were so sick. There were 750 to 1,000 sick people were processed each day for over 3 weeks through the human laundry. And I calculated by my mom's anecdotes, by little stories she told me, were like windows into what happened, because based on some things she told me, I calculated she was either in the first or second group to be taken to go through the human laundry. There were 361 soldiers and medical personnel on 2 days after the liberation. As I said, right after the liberation, there was no manpower, and the British had to leave Hungarian guards in charge who were just trigger happy shooting the prisoners. So even the liberation was a very complex liberation. It was not like all of a sudden the liberators come in, the Allies come in, and everybody's cheering. And no, most of the people were devastated. They were already quite far gone, and the British they were fighting battles in the area. Glenn Hughes did not have medical units he could spare. He had to really figure out where he could get help from. 500 former inmates died each day for a month after the liberation. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried. And 14,000 patients were ultimately being treated in the Glenn Hughes Hospital, barely being treated because there wasn't really any kind of individualized medical attention for quite a while, for several weeks. My mom was one of them. The survivors who worked closely with Glenn Hughes, there were some who were in better shape, who could help him organize some help from among the survivors, named the hospital the largest in Europe. They named it the Glenn Hughes Hospital. They named it after him because they observed his reactions, his compassion, his working to save lives. So the rescue really was underway from April 23rd to May 21st. Here's a sign for the Glenn Hughes Hospital. This is the largest part. It was actually a whole complex. And here is Glenn Hughes giving the order. He gives the order for a ceremony on May 21st, which is for the last evacuated barrack to be burned down in Bergen-Belsen. And that was a big, he would not have the Union Jack, the British flag, raised not on Victory in Europe Day, not on May 8th. He waited until May 21st, until the last person was evacuated from the last hut. And it was quite a moment. I mean, this is a little country, Maldives, right off of near Sri Lanka. And then commemorating the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, they issued a bunch of stamps, and one of them was of the burning of the last hut in Bergen-Belsen. This was the actual picture, and this is the stamp. So now we get onto the question of overcoming adversity. So I would say that the survivors, there were people who lost their child or their parent, and people were dying constantly, and people were mourning their losses. And I would say that, and they hadn't had food. One of the things that you may know is that the British Tommies, the British soldiers, when they first came into Bergen-Belsen, they were so overcome with emotion. I mean, they sometimes just gave the prisoners whatever they had, their rations, and they prepared the wrong kind of food for them. And at least 2,000 people died on account of their last meal. So with shriveled intestines and body organs that are also just shriveled, you had to really give people very careful diet, slowly let them come back to health very slowly. It took time. And as one survivor said, in terms of returning to life, show us the sun, but slowly. So while mourning incalculable losses, survivors, nearly all of whom had lost most of their relatives, formed a vibrant displaced persons community. And this is an extraordinary story of human resilience. The devout and the secular, those who had lost faith and those who held fast to Jewish precepts, united around a common goal: to create a meaningful narrative of their sufferings by turning their sights to a Jewish homeland and to a future in which they could live normal lives. And now, Cynthia, I'm going to ask you to play the first video. It's actually just a sound recording of the first Sabbath, the first Shabbat after the liberation, where one of the rabbis is organizing a service for the survivors, and they are saying a prayer called the Hatikva. The hope.
Okay.
Hatikva means the hope. So this is an actual recording of their voices. Thank you, Cynthia. So I'm just going to continue sharing the screen. So what a testament to survival and to sort of beginning. Just to hear their voices is just brings tears to my eyes. So uniting around a common goal. So the extraordinary thing that happened is that there were some people who were in Bergen-Belsen who were in their late 20s, early 30s, and they knew how to organize. They had been members of Zionist youth groups before the war. And so they knew how to get people together around this cause. And this man here is named Yossel Rosensaft, an incredible story of survival, his own story. And he's a young man. He's just the man that the Nazis couldn't kill. He had very many narrow escapes, and he emerged as a leader. And there were some others who joined him. They had been members of different Zionist groups, and they started to give people this hope of looking toward the Zionist state, looking toward entering Palestine and starting to be in a place where the Jews couldn't be slaughtered. They had lost so much. And there was a group of men who were part of the Jewish Brigade. They were a group of men who were actually fighting the Nazis. They were a British brigade that was working out of Palestine, and they had come to Europe, and they came to visit Bergen-Belsen. And for the Belsen survivors to see these men in uniform, these elegant looking men who could talk to them about what the land was like in Israel, was very powerful. So this was a very, I would say that uniting around this goal, being really quite unhappy being in these displaced persons camp, because Bergen-Belsen continued for a number of years to be a displaced persons camp. People wanted to start their life. Most of the people who survived were in their 20s and 30s. They were trying to meet people, get married, form families, and they wanted to start anew. And they had their eyes set on Palestine, because where could the Jewish people go and have their own nation? And so it was very politically unhappy situation for the British, because British officialdom, they had their own interests in the Middle East, and it was very difficult. They did not want to let the Jews in. Their first thought is the survivors should be repatriated. They should go back to the lands they came from. While this might have been possible in France or in certain other countries in the Western Europe, for the Jews to go back to Eastern Europe was just unthinkable. It was just that very few went back and could live their lives there because their whole communities had been destroyed. There was nothing to go back for. So they needed to unite around this goal. So another sort of sign of the resilience and what was happening in the displaced persons camp. Oh, by the way, I should just say that Glenn Hughes was totally above the fray. He was an advocate of the survivors, and it was so unusual at the time. And I don't know whether he had to pay a price for it or not. I raised that as a question in my book because he didn't get certain things he wanted at the end of the war. But he was showing up at the first Zionist Congress in September. He was making an appearance. He was totally enthralled with this Joseph Rosensaft and the other young leaders that emerged. He was captivated by them. He was amazed. Even when his tour of duty ended, he kept going back to the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp all summer and into the fall. He was very taken with the survivors and how they sort of didn't really overcame, took time, but how they dealt with their situation. And one of the things they set up very quickly was a theater, right? There were at least 12,000 people in the displaced persons camp. People were coming from all over. It was the largest DP camp in the British zone of Germany. And they set up the concentration camp theater where they would, and now here's the performers, where they would enact plays this says ghetto, which depicted the experiences, the trauma that they suffered. And thousands of people would come to see these performances, people who were well enough. And they just bawled their eyes out. It was a very cathartic thing. But they had a theater to come to grips with things. They had a newspaper. They had their own police force. They had a magazine, an area where people could come get clothes. They organized the distribution of clothes that they got from civilians in the surrounding area who had to surrender clothes or blankets. And their Organization for Rehabilitation and Training, ORT, set up workshops in the Belsen DP camp and in other places where they trained people for professions after the war, for mechanical engineering, for sewing, for all kinds of things. So there was a lot going on in terms of this community of people who had suffered so much. And there was, of course, the young people, not my mother, but the people who were a little bit older than her, who survived, were looking to couple. They were looking to rebuild. They had lost their families, in some cases their entire families, in some cases their spouses and their children were killed in Auschwitz, and they were looking to rebuild anew. So they coupled off very quickly. This was like the largest baby boom ever in history. They totally had more children than the German women were having at that time. And babies were born in the DP camp, and little kindergartens and schools were set up in the camp. It was a historical phenomena. Talk about overcoming adversity. And it was complicated. It was really complicated because what happens if someone survived and they didn't know whether their spouse was alive or not? And what happens if the spouse turns up? I mean, people were separated. Families were torn apart. So the rabbis had a special ketubah, which is the Jewish marriage contract that is given to the couple at the Jewish wedding ceremony, and they made provisions in it just in case a spouse turned up alive, that they should be entitled to certain things. So 420 men and 300 women who had been married did not know the fates of their spouses. They were granted permission to remarry with a caveat. So now I'm going to ask Cynthia to put up this. This is a 3-minute video of Tzvi Asaria Herman Helfgott, who was a rabbi who came, he had been liberated elsewhere. He came to the British zone. He came to the Belsen DP camp fairly early on, and it talks about, he shares his experience.
אני עברתי יום-יום מבלוק לבלוק לראות מי נפטר, להוציא אותם אבל
Sorry,
מה?
video quality isn't
פקודה
great.
מאנגלים, שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות בגלל המחלות, אלא קבר אחים. קבר אחים. כולם יחד. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, ועל זה שוב כן איזה 30-20 וזה, כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שאלפים כן, כן. אבל יום אחד ניגשה אליי אישה ואמרה לי, רבי, שמעתי היום שבבלוק הזה וזה, ביתי נפטרה. אז אמרתי, אז מה לעשות? אני רוצה קבר בשבילה, קבר יחיד. אמרתי, אבל זה בלתי אפשרי. אבל לכן אני מבקשת ממך. אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? בלילה כשחיילים בדרך כלל, האנגלים, נמצאים במועדונים, אז אנחנו נקבור אותם. אנחנו נביא את הגופה, ואנחנו כן נקבור אותה. ובאמת, בלילה היא קמה מהמיטה, ואני ניסיתי מהר לקבור אותה, קדיש להגיד, ופתאום כשאני רציתי כבר סתום את הגולל, היא אומרת לי, רגע אחד רבי. והיא פנתה עם העיניים לשמיים ואמרה, ריבונו של עולם, ביידיש, אני מודה לך לזכות הגדולה שנתת לי היום לקבור את ביתי במו ידיים. אמן. מרגע זה, אני מוכרח להגיד, נעשיתי אדם אחר. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, כן, בדרך לחיים. ופה התחלנו ראשון לדאוג, היו כמה ילדים לגן ילדים, ואחר כך להקים בית ספר, כן. פה עזרו לנו הרבה אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלזן גם כן. והקמנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. חיים חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה אני עסקתי עד 48, כן. פה בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו' וכו' וכו'. ואני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל משפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם חופה וקידושים שאני אחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היה בילד האלף כשאני החזקתי בידיים. הילד האלף.
Hi. So, so I just want to, there's one more brief video. But just in the interest of time, I think we're gonna stop that. But if you want, you can copy down this URL, and it's just sort of a summary of what I've told you. And yeah, you can copy down the URL if you can, or I could send it to Cynthia or Diane. It's about children who were born in Bergen-Belsen, and it's put out by the World Jewish Congress. And there were about 2,000 babies born there. So whoops, can you
I think
see
it's
the
only
screen?
about 90 seconds long if you want me to play it. It's not long at all.
Okay.
Okay. I assume this is the third video you sent me, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, it's very short. Yeah, let's watch it.
Okay. So thank you. So that's pretty much sums up a lot of what I was telling you. So I'll just very briefly tell you that about my mother and her situation, and a little bit about Glenn Hughes, and I'll turn it over for questions. Just my mom was not part of the Belsen DP camp for very long because the Swedish government, in a humanitarian gesture and for reasons of their own, said they would take in survivors who were very sick to rehabilitate them, to put them on their feet. And they had in mind that maybe they would take them in and cure them of whatever they had. And 6 months later, they'd be on their way, maybe to their, again, repatriated. They didn't really understand. My mom stayed in Sweden for 10 years after the war. So she was in and out of TB sanatoriums. She was very sick. So this little chart that I created is just a little microcosm of what the stats, and it shows you just how the age of the people, really, it tells you who on a larger scale was killed during the Holocaust, because this just shows the birth year of Belsen survivors from Siget who arrived in Sweden. So that means people who were taken from the same hometown as my mom that had about 12,000 Jews before the war, and 90% were killed in Auschwitz, and then they the ones who were remaining were taken to labor camps, and not all of them wound up in Bergen-Belsen, and not all of them who survived Bergen-Belsen wound up in Sweden, but of those that did, there was about 174 from that original 12,000 people. And of the 174, this is the age range. So there's a couple of people in their 50s, a few in their 40s. There were some people who were in their 30s, but most of the people were in their 20s. The largest, so it's 1945, so it's like 22 years old is the largest number. I had an aunt who was born in 1924. I had two aunts who were born in 1918. I had one aunt who was born in 1928, and here's my mom in red. She's one of the youngest ones you can see who just survived the Holocaust. And there was a few younger than her from her hometown. And here, in terms of overcoming adversity, this is the very first image we have of my mom. She was taken in Sweden. This is like the second quarantined place she was taken to. It was a hospital. Here she is. Really sick. And this doctor here, with the kindest, nicest blue eyes, saved her life. Was the first time she had really individualized medical attention. She would always tell me about Dr. Leffler. And then she was taken, a part of her journey in Sweden was 10 years, I said, in and out of TB hospitals. When I was growing up, Sweden always sounded like an adventure. She always told me about the positive things because she's a positive person, but the truth was that she was moving around from place to place, in and out of rest homes and hospitals, and half the time sick and half the time trying to make her way in the world as an orphan. And this was one of the places that I attribute a great deal to in terms of her healing. It was this place called Smedsbo or Bichubi. It was in Sweden, and there was about 56 teenage girls that were taken there to get some form of education. And here were a few of the teachers, women who were in their like early 30s, who were also survivors, who understood where the girls had been and the psychology of how to teach refugees from a war-torn place. And here is a little bit from the epilogue of my book. So here's my mom. This is a blow up of her in that very first picture. You can still see the black and blue mark under her eyes. It's just a few months after the liberation. Sadly, this is the only picture I have. This is the first picture I have of her. I have nothing from her childhood, nothing of my grandparents. There's not a single photo that has survived from Siget, from her family from before the war. So this is the earliest picture I have of her. And she's 15 years old here. Several years later, she's in her early 20s. That's her and her sister in Sweden, and they're making their way. And Sweden, I have to say, was a very healing place. Swedish people were very kind to the survivors, and there's not a survivor I know who was taken to Sweden who didn't have nice things to say about being in Sweden after the war. It was sort of like this antidote after they had been through this oppressive Nazi regime, to be taken to a place where they could heal. and get nourishing food and recover. And here's my mom today. She speaks about her Holocaust experiences to school groups from really now all over the world. And this is my dad. He's in a displaced persons camp. He's also a survivor of the Holocaust, and this is their wedding photo. They married in Sweden. This is Glenn Hughes, and you can see the look in his eyes. This is him at the time of the liberation, and the seriousness and the weight of what his responsibilities were. And here he is some years later. He was an athlete, as I mentioned before, and the experience, he had his childhood experience of adversity, and then the experience of liberating the camp was also a watershed for him in his life. It changed a lot of things about him, and late in his life, he was very influential in the hospice movement. And I think that he, as a humanitarian, he had seen people die such horrible deaths, and he really cared about how people exited this world and what their days were like at the end. So he devoted a lot of time and research to that. And that was just one of the many things he was involved in. So that's the end. I'm going to stop my share now. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, Bernice, thank you so much. I can't imagine a more inspirational lecture appropriate for the theme of overcoming adversity. And I know I was chatting with Cynthia while you were speaking, but we're both rushing out to get your book. And I would imagine everyone in this audience would be well served by doing the same. All the Horrors of War. Now, if you would like to send me your questions or comments, I'll be glad to pass them on. We have one that says, my father survived Belsen, 18 years old, 68 pounds, and barely alive. After he recovered some, he wanted the hell out of there, anywhere but Europe. He and some buddies that survived ended up in Gotland Island in Sweden. He cried every time he spoke of how generous and kind they were. Another comment, the first Allied liberation at the Ohrdruf camp was on April 4th, 1945, just 11 days before Bergen-Belsen was liberated. Was word getting around Allied command of the existence of concentration camps in early April? Was the British Second Army aware of the Bergen-Belsen camp prior to April 15th? Was there pressure on the Allied forces to invade Germany faster to liberate more camps, knowing thousands were dying every day?
Well, that's a multi-part question. That's a great question. So they knew, like Lynn Hughes anticipated that they would come across concentration camps and prisoner of war camps. And they did come across several camps before they even got to Bergen-Belsen. It was still a total shock. Like, it's not anything he had seen. In fact, the title of the book comes from his words when he first testified. He was the first witness at the first international war crimes trial. Before Nuremberg, there was the Belsen trial. And he said, I have seen all the horrors of war, but I have seen nothing to touch it. So it was a shock. They were told by the Germans that there were like 1,500 people that were sick in the camp. They weren't expecting 55,000 people. So it was so beyond. So they knew just very vaguely. I mean, I don't think he really even understood, even though he had such a high position, he didn't really understand what it was until he walked in. That there were people from all over Europe there. That was a surprise to him. And what was going on in Auschwitz was, even though the high up knew, but I don't think he knew, and he was quite high up, I don't think he knew the details. They knew vaguely and roughly. They weren't in a rush to liberate the camps to save the inmates. That wasn't why they were just trying to win the war fast. That was like a byproduct, was saving lives. And then they could say, they could come into Bergen-Belsen and say to the British public, this was the reason we were fighting the war. This is the reason so many men were lost. It was for, and the liberation was the most documented of all the liberations in Europe. They had the film and photography unit of the British Army come in right away. And those men who were doing the filming and who were taking photographs really got sick from doing it. I mean, I know that at least one of them said he was never going to take war photographs again. I mean, their charge was they weren't used to photographing mounds of dead people, but they did it for the historical record. And it was a shock. And it wasn't the reason. They were just trying to really win the war. Remember, they had the Allies, the British especially, had suffered the Blitzkrieg. They had their reasons.
What, if any, mental health support was provided to survivors and their families?
So that varied tremendously, right? It depended on what was going on in the years after the war. Immediately, Glenn Hughes brought a psychiatrist from the army into Bergen-Belsen, and he was coming like every few weeks and evaluating the progress of the survivors. And he really, even like the second or third visit, he thought there was no chance these people were going to be normal functioning human beings again. But Glenn Hughes thought otherwise, because he was seeing signs that once people were, and so did other like medical students and doctor who were working closely with the people. I mean, the people were doing crazy things. When the nurses first came in and the first people I write about it in my book, how like somebody would sneak away at night and they'd come back and they'd find like chickens under their bed, like they'd go to a neighboring farm. I mean, people were starved, and it took a long time. Like my mother was even in Sweden, and people were still taking their dinner rolls back and putting them under their pillow at night. I mean, these were people who had been so deprived. So slowly, there was the mental institutions were filling up quickly with survivors. In Israel, there was a lot of them. I mean, it was a crazy making experience. But I think against all odds, the vast majority of survivors went on to lead productive, healthy lives, which was quite something in terms of overcoming adversity.
Absolutely. This is an interesting question. The person asks, I hope you don't mind this question. I'm very curious about your mother's thinking. During the time of the camps, did she ever believe that she would one day be liberated? Or was it a surreal experience when the liberation happened?
So my mom was a kid, and sometimes that's hard for me to remember, like too, that, but she always had hope. My father was a very different type of survivor. He hoped to die during the war. She hoped to live. She always hoped, even until landing in Bergen-Belsen. She still hoped, false hope, that she would see her parents again, even having been in Auschwitz and being told that they were up in that smoke. She still always hoped that she would go back home and things would be normal, until the very end, when she really saw the reality. And then when she was laying in a makeshift hospital room dying, certain things that went through her mind, that gave her the will to survive. Like Viktor Frankl said, he who has a why to live will bear with almost anyhow. Like she had her whys to live. If she died, she knew her sister was okay, and then she would leave her sister all alone in the world. If she died, she was only 15. She hadn't had a boyfriend. She hadn't had she had this sense, this very mature sense as a kid, that she hadn't really lived her life yet, that there was still a future. She had no idea how sick she was, how long it would take to recover, what her future would look like, but she had these sort of mature thoughts. And then her last exchange with her father in the cattle car, but right before they came to Auschwitz, her father said to her, I have confidence in you. You're a strong girl. I know you're going to make it. And when she's laying there dying in Bergen-Belsen, and really dying, she was put in a special place for people who were expected to die. Those words came back to her, and she willed herself to survive.
Another audience member asked, how did your aunt survive?
My aunt survived in partnership with my mom. And she was 17 at the end of the war, and they tried really hard to stick together the entire war. Earlier, there was in Auschwitz, my aunt was actually picked to live in one incident, and my mother was selected for the gas chamber. And my aunt sacrificed her life to go with my mom. And then by a miracle, they both were the next selection, they both passed. And after that, my mom did everything she could to help her sister, help her survive, help get her whatever she could, a little bit of food, a little better job. You know, they went through a lot together, but it was really helpful to have a close relative to be with.
Of course. Do you know anything about the shared wedding dress at the DP camp? I heard someone kept it and that there was a museum exhibit with it many years later.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I heard of a wedding dress being made out of a white parachute that felt, you know, that they were very resourceful and innovative. That I heard of that, but I don't know anything about it. But I'm sure it was passed around.
Auschwitz was one of the most dangerous death camps in the entire Holocaust. How did your mother manage to be transferred out of one of the most lethal camps and go to Bergen-Belsen?
Well, she would say it was a miracle, but I will tell you the backstory. A little bit of the backstory is that the Germans were losing the war and they desperately needed labor for the factories, for the munitions factories, for the clothing, the uniforms factories, they needed the labor. So there was kind of these arguments among the SS, those who wanted to kill people right away and those who wanted to let the manufacturers come in and select the strongest, most able-bodied people to work them to death. So at least they'd get some work out of them. And so that's why they were losing the war. This is what took place in the summer of 1944 in Auschwitz, is they had these continual selections and they siphoned off people. It's random. A lot of it is just random and luck, because once she was picked for the gas chamber, she managed to escape that. And another time, finally she was picked in one of these selections to go to be sent out to a labor camp, her and her sister together. And some of it is so random, like even in Bergen-Belsen, at the very end of the war, when the medics went in, they marked some people's foreheads who had no chance of survival. And they left people for dead who maybe if they would have had some treatment could have lived, could have survived. So it's luck.
Is there any particular reason that your parents chose Sweden as the place to go after surviving? You stated that a lot of Jews went to North America and Israel, so why was Sweden the place for them?
So it wasn't a choice, right? My mom, she couldn't make any decision for herself. She just went with whatever. And the Swedish government took in about 7,000 really sick survivors from Bergen-Belsen on this humanitarian mission. So she was one of them, and her sister. And so she was in Sweden and there was no place for her to go from there. I mean, she was very sick, so she was constantly in and out of TB sanatoriums. My father, in the meantime, was in the United States after the war. He came in 1948, 3 years after the end of the war. And I'm working on writing his story now. He had to go to Sweden to meet her and marry her in Sweden 10 years after the war, or 9 years after the war.
It seemed that Zionism was popular among the Jewish people after the war. How do attitudes towards Zionism differ today?
Oh, it depends who you ask. It depends on your vantage point. But I would say that the vast majority of Holocaust survivors and their descendants regard the state of Israel as really critical to the future, to the existence of the Jewish people. I mean, it's changed a lot. And we're not talking about the pioneer years. We're talking about a mature Israel now. But the narrative and what happened was the Jewish people were so imperiled. And I can just tell you that growing up, one of my uncles, my father's brother, wound up in Israel, and my parents were very, very committed to Israel and the Jewish state. They didn't want to live there themselves, but we always had Hebrew pioneer songs in the background, and they were very, very following all the events in the news. And to this day, my mom still worries for the state of Israel, worries so much by the news and the stories that are coming out. And it's a real concern, because it's very important that this state of Israel exists and survives.
How has your parents' experiences shaped you as a person and as an educator?
Hmm. Oh, I'm sure in huge ways. Uh, it's really made me, I think that many, like other children of survivors, at least for me, I can speak for myself, that when I read of the news, if I read about what's happening to refugee children from Syria or Myanmar or anybody suffering, it really, I think, sensitizes you, because you wish you could, do something. You hope the leaders will act. It's really upon them. They have to do something, because to be in those situations where humanitarian crises are calling for help, you worry, you take it upon yourself. You really feel the feelings of what it's like to feel abandoned by the world. So it sensitizes you in a way, and it also, so many things. I mean, for me, it also plagues me in a way, because because of what happened, anything can happen. Like, there's a reality. So that bad things can happen is sort of like viscerally, like, I worry for my own family, for my children, for my grandchildren, because I'm aware that life can turn on a dime and really terrible things can happen. And I worry about certain rhetoric that I hear and certain things I read. It affects me because I have this knowledge of what is possible. So that really influenced me. And for several years, I was directing an ethics center. So I think I brought sort of that framework and that lens to my understanding of the Holocaust and the various characters and personalities and how it could happen.
On a similar note, children of survivors carry a lot of the horror and trauma of their parents. Do you think you do? And do you think your children do?
Yeah, so there's a lot about that. There's like this. First there was, in the early 80s and 70s and 80s, there was a lot of articles written by psychologists about the trauma being transferred to the next generation, about survivors in therapy. And then there was a lot of studies about children of survivors. A lot of them apparently went into the helping professions. But I can't say there were as many ways of surviving as there were survivors. And there's even more permutations among children of survivors. I mean, I have cousins who are children of survivors who are nothing like me and who don't think the way I do. So I don't know. I can't say this epigenetic thing that goes on, like maybe, but I'm not sure. I mean, do I still get pleasure and enjoyment out of a lot of things in my life? Maybe even more so. Like, maybe it's like heightened certain things for me. I appreciate, like, even during the pandemic, like, I feel so bad for people who don't have a warm home or a cozy bed, or I appreciate. And I would say that my mom is, because she was so, like, even from the time she was a kid, she had to be so independent. She had to work so hard for her family. She appreciates, like, she'll call me up and she'll say, guess what? My next door neighbor, like, they came with their snowplow and they shoveled my sidewalk for me. And she's like bowled over with appreciation for anything, any little thing anyone would do for her. And my father was like that too, because it's not only because they're survivors, but because of their character and how much they had to fend for themselves their entire life. They're not used to getting help, very much. So.
How successful were efforts to bring SS soldiers to trial at the Belsen trials?
Terrible. Hundreds just disappeared from the camp and got off. So the Belsen trial, I mean, these war crimes trials were largely symbolic. So many of the Nazis just got off. It was terrible. So there were 44 people and the head, Kramer, that were prosecuted in Bergen-Belsen. Like, I guess they were in the most prominent SS positions, and 11 of them, I think, were hung. I wrote an article about the Belsen trial, but it was, listen, Glenn Hughes was the first witness at the first international war crimes trial. He had to set the tone. It was the first time film footage was shown at a trial. And he took the jury, he took the court to visit the camp also and to show them the sites.
Wow.
It was but it was, you couldn't hope for justice. I mean, my mother, when she was in Sweden, listened to the Nuremberg trials. For her, it was like a joke. It really drove home to her as a young person that there is no real justice in the world. You can't expect it, and it doesn't happen.
How did your parents go about telling you what they had gone through?
Very organically, like not like I sat down ever to interview them. I wrote another book about 7 Holocaust survivors I'm not related to, and those people I interviewed, but my parents never. I never had a tape recorder going, and I never took notes. It was just organically as it came up. We could be talking about something else and see something, and it would trigger a memory, and the anecdotes would come out. And only over decades and decades of hearing the stories was I able to place them, get the scaffold, get the framework, place them, and do research surrounding what they told me to really make sense of what they had gone through. And when I wrote the book, of course, I was very blessed to have my mom with me, because I could call her up with these insane questions like, when you were on the death march, I'm so sorry to take you back to that place, but when you were on the death march, do you remember what you were wearing? You know, as questions would come to me as I was writing a work of nonfiction, not fiction. I wanted to be as accurate as I could. So I would plumb her memory in that way. And she was very forthcoming always.
Does your mother or father suffer from PTSD?
I would say my mother, no. I would say my father, yes. And it took me a long time to realize that he was really, it took me a long time to realize that when he was the first Jew to come back to his small village, and he came back to his house, and the beds were practically still warm. Just a few months earlier, his parents and his siblings were taken to Auschwitz and murdered, that okay, he doesn't want to let any loved one out of his sight, because when you're away from, when they're out of your sight, something tragic could happen. So, and he was emaciated, he was in really bad shape at the end of the war. But so just to give you an example of how I experienced his PTSD when I was in high school, and I was like president of my youth group chapter, and I'd have to go run a meeting. He would be like, oh, can't you just stay home and read a book? Like, can't you just stay home? So, he worried at night, bad things can happen. And when we would watch the news, look what can happen, so because it really happened to him. So I think he suffered in that way. He was a very warm, basically happy, kind, lovely human being. My friends adored him. Everybody loved him. But I think he carried this past with him emotionally.
What was the caveat for newly married Jewish people in case their spouses returned?
They would have to give them, like, let's say they earned a living and they had some resources and some money, they would have to give a portion of it to the spouse, to the one that they didn't know was alive or not.
How old were you when you decided you wanted to share their story? Or what triggered you to share their story?
Yeah. So quite old, because I didn't actually, truth be told, honestly, I didn't set out to write a book about my mother. I set out to write a book about Glenn Hughes. It was only when I was interested in how the mechanics of exactly how she survived, because she fell unconscious at the end of the war in Bergen-Belsen, and I wanted to know how she was rescued, and that led me to Glenn Hughes. So I was really working on his life story, because I thought he deserved to be as well known as Oskar Schindler. And then people kept saying to me, but your mom's story is so interesting, your mom's story. So then I thought, could I write a dual biography? And that's when I started to. So that was about 10 years ago, 12 years ago.
Well, we have a few more minutes. If someone else would like to submit a question, or any of our panelists have a question to ask Dr. Lerner. And if not, Bernice, we thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was as I said, a very inspirational presentation, And I'm certain our students will have much to learn from it and to live with. Thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.